Class, today we're going to be doing lesson number 2 of Unit 1, the Fundamentals of Economics. Today's lesson is Fallacies and Theories. So before we go into today's lesson, I want you to make sure you check your homework. This is from page 14, numbers 1 to 4. So please check your answers to ensure that you have something similar to what I have to make sure that you aren't wondering what's going on. And also, if you have any questions or concerns about any of the answers that are listed, please send me a message and I'll try to clarify either in person or over message or on the next video. Thank you. So today's lesson, Fallacies and Theories, talks about knowing how to explain each fallacy and theory and how to draw the PPC and PPF, be able to interpret said PPC and PPF and apply the economic laws, and to understand each of the fallacies and economic laws well. To succeed in today's lessons, you'll hopefully be able to apply each fallacy and theory and apply the PPC in our discussions. Of course, always completion and review of your homework expectations. So to start today's lesson, we want to go over and look at a couple of questions. The first question we want to talk about deals with is free trade good? And so, again, when we talk about economic theory, we're not talking about black and white and always right or always wrong, but we're talking about situational things, views of opinion. Remember, in our previous lesson, we talked about doing the right things in the right ways, and with right being in quotation marks. And so we understand, like, do we think implementing a free trade policy is right or is good? And so if you look at what's happening or what has happened over the last little while with the United States and China, how some of these trade relationships are going sour, and even with Canada and the United States, there are tariffs going up and trade happening, even though we do have a free trade agreement with the United States. And so what makes free trade good and what makes free trade bad? And so if you take a moment to think about the pros and cons of each side, you might come up with different ideas or different realizations. And so even when you go on to the internet space and people are going to fight for one versus the other, well, and it's not an absolute good or bad kind of situation. So for example, if you look at free trade and you think about, is it good? Theoretically, it should be good, because if we have free trade, things come into our country cheaper, and consumers should be able to buy things at a cheaper value and potentially at a higher quality if we're trading with nations that could do things better, right? So that seems like it's good for the overall. However, if we have local producers that produce that same thing in our country, they're going to be hurt by free trade from other countries, right? And so when you think about that, like, there's two different scenarios, and both are equally relevant. It's just what side do you sit on? And that side is going to probably determine what way you may vote or what way you may argue for something, right? And so we want to make sure you look at both sides and try to figure out, what is good, what is bad in your point of view. Okay. The next question we're going to be talking about in class is the redevelopment of Kerr Street a good idea? And so if you're not familiar with Kerr Street in downtown Oakville, there's lots of lower income housing there, or subsidized housing. And if you don't know it well, you might think, oh, that's downtown Oakville. Its property is super, super valuable. And you're right. Like, if you look down there, there is high-end restaurants. There is a development of the area around that's very, very highly valuable. Even on Kerr Street, restaurants are going up. It's getting more trendy. And the problem is the land is so valuable. And so as you redevelop that land, you put up more valuable pieces of property, and the property value of the entire area will probably go up, and people will be happy, and developers will be happy. But who's that bad for, right? If there are low-income areas there, if there are people that rely on some of the services that exist around Kerr Street, because if you go around other parts of Oakville, there are very little pockets where you could see social services where people who are displaced or people with lower incomes can go and live that lifestyle, right? And so if Kerr Street is redeveloped, it's good for people who have the wealth and who can benefit from that. But that whole cohort of individuals, you say, where do they go? Or what do they do? What can they do? Right? So, and who has the most money to push their agenda? The people who want the new redevelopment of Kerr Street, probably, at the expense of people who can't push their agenda or who have less resources to push that agenda. right? So whose responsibility is it to care for these people? And so these are questions that we have to figure out and talk about and understand that while the answer may seem very simple to you in the moment, there are complexities that analysts, politicians, political scientists have to think about as they look at different issues. And so these are just two primer questions that we want to look at before we go into the rest of the lesson. So the first half of the lesson we're going to look at is the fallacies. And so the fallacies we're talking about are when we talk about untruths. So a fallacy is something that is widely believed to be true, yet is not true. And so we're not saying that it's never true. We're just saying that it's not always true. And so someone can't use this as an argument to back up a point, right? Because it's always true, but in reality, it's not always true. And so let's take some examples first. And so one is the fallacy of competition. The fallacy of competition states this: an individual benefit automatically translates into societal benefit, and vice versa. So a societal benefit should automatically translate into individual benefit. And so someone may say, well, it's good for me, it's good for everyone. Or if a political party says this is going to be better for the nation, better for all of us, yet in that statement, better for all of us, it implies better for everyone. And while yes, it may be true that it's better corporately for everyone, there are individuals who are going to suffer in that scenario, right? And so it can be stated as something is true of the whole just because it is true of some part of the whole, which is untrue. So both of these statements, individual benefit automatically translates into societal benefit, and if something is true of the whole, just because some part of the whole is true, those statements are actually fallacies. Okay, so the statement is not always true. So that is the fallacy. Okay, so the fallacy of competition says these things, while can be true in some scenarios, are not always true. Okay, and so our example could be free trade. Like I mentioned before, free trade is good theoretically, corporately, right? Better quality products can come into our country, cheaper products can come into our country, more variety of products can come into our country. Think about oranges, right? We have trade with the United States. If we wanted to get oranges, we get oranges from the US, from Florida or whatnot. And with free trade, those oranges come into our country cheaper, and we can buy them cheaper. Without free trade, either one, we have to grow our own oranges, which is going to be extraordinarily expensive because of our climate, or two, they just become more expensive to import, right? So corporately, theoretically, it should become better, right? But individually, there are individuals who are going to struggle because of this, because their markets get hurt because of this or whatnot, right? So you can't use that fallacy. You can't use the statement, well, it's good for everyone, so it should be good for you, as a justification for implementing some type of policy, right? Because that policy, while maybe good for many, many people, might not be good for the one. And so you can't blame that one individual for voting against it or fighting for their own, right? Even though they are the minority, right? You can't just assume that better for all is better for the one, and that's what should be good enough justification for them to go along with it, right? And so the next fallacy we're going to talk about is the post hoc fallacy. The post hoc fallacy is if event B occurs after event A, then event A must have caused event B. Okay, so it's also called the cause and effect fallacy. And so the cause and effect fallacy could be given as an example of a rooster crowing before the sun rises, right? So if the rooster crows, and right after the rooster crows, the sun always rises, event B, the sun rising, occurring after event A, then A must have caused event B to happen. Does the rooster crowing cause the sun to rise? Of course not. We all know that is not true. But if someone used this fallacy and said, that happens all the time, therefore this must be the truth, it's incorrect. So that's why this is a fallacy. Event B occurring after event A, therefore event A must have caused event B. that is a fallacy. It is not. It is untrue, even though it can be true in some instances, right? Another example is superstitions, right? When you think about some type of superstitions, that if you see a black cat, you'll get bad luck, right? Even though if you see a black cat and then something unlucky happens to you, seeing the black cat is not likely the thing that's going to give you bad luck. Or if you're, some athletes have superstitions where, they wore this striped pair of socks before this game, and so therefore they think that the socks helped them win that game. Therefore, they're always going to wear those socks and hoping that the socks will help them win that game, right? And the socks had nothing to do with them winning that game. And we could go into arguments about their mentality, their headspace. Sure, those are all different things. But the socks physically had nothing to do with their skill level of that player, right? So that is an example of the post hoc fallacy, okay? The third fallacy we're going to talk about is the fallacy of single causation. And so the fallacy of single causation states this: a single factor or person caused an event to occur, okay? And so this is an oversimplification fallacy. Again, single events can cause events to occur. So right, we're not saying that these things are never true. We're saying that they are not always true. You cannot always draw a conclusion from this thing happening and then you believing that that thing caused the other thing, okay? We're oversimplifying the sequence of events for something to have happened. And so if I asked you what caused the Great Depression, right? Lots of people are going to say the stock market crash. And that will be wrong, right? The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. The stock market crash was part of the Great Depression. It was one of the, one of the things that happened as part of a cascade of events that caused the Great Depression. In fact, the same things that caused the stock market crash are the things that caused the Great Depression, right? The stock market crash in itself did not happen and then the Great Depression happened, right? It so happens that they're part of the same thing. So saying that would be an oversimplification of what actually occurred in reality. And so if you look at the post hoc fallacy and the fallacy of single causation, the post hoc fallacy is much more of a, these two events actually don't have any impact on each other, okay? While the fallacy of single causation is yes, they do relate, but they're oversimplified, okay? So this one is very little relationship, if any, and this one is there is a relationship, but you've oversimplified the relationship or the cause and effect of it, right? So those are the three fallacies. And so it's good for you to figure out your own examples to help you remember them and learn them, but sometimes those things can trip people up a little bit. So be sure to send me messages with questions, write your questions down, ask me at a later time whenever you need to, all right? So these fallacies are a way of kind of getting you into thinking economically, thinking less about, just reactionary kinds of things, less about just, this is what I believe, versus, let's analyze something. Let's look at why things work. Let's look at how things work. Getting yourself in an economic mindset, okay? And so we're going to take that to take us to the next step, which is to look at some economic theories and economic truths, okay? So production possibilities curve is an important thing in economics, and so you want to understand the production possibilities curve as it illustrates the fundamental problem of scarcity, which we talked about last lesson, okay? Scarcity being one of the key factors in the problem of economics and why we study economics, because we need to solve this problem of scarcity versus unlimited wants, right? And so let's make a couple of assumptions before I kind of dive deep into what the production possibilities curve is. So one, we are only going to consider two products for now. We know in reality there are many, many, many products, but to simplify our explanation, we want to look at only two products. Two, there's constant technology and resources. So in this moment that we look at this curve, we're looking at a static moment. We're looking at what is our production possibilities curve right now with the current level of technology and the current level of resources that we have. Okay, and so if things are changing, the curve will change. So we need to look at something in a static state. Okay, three, The economy is at full employment of resources, and so we're looking at an extreme scenario, right, where we're operating at our capacity to operate. Okay, so these are three assumptions that we need to make sure we think about and understand as we look at this analysis. And so this scenario is our production possibilities curve, right? And so our scenario is we can produce both shirts and bread. Those are our two products. Remember, we said there are only two products in this scenario. And so conveniently, we have two axes. The x-axis where bread is and the y-axis where shirts are. And so again, if you think about if we wanted to do 7 different things, we would need 7 different axes, right? So that will extraordinarily complicate our graph and visually be impossible to look at. And so that's why we simplify it like this. But this theory can be applied to, all the things we create, produce, service, right? And so we can make either shirts or bread. Okay, so if we imagine the origin being 0, being right here on this curve indicates that we're making lots of bread. This could be a number for bread, and we're making 0 shirts, right? So lots of bread, 0 shirts. Well, here we have 0 bread and lots of shirts. Okay, and we could also produce anywhere on this line of some amount of bread and some amount of shirts. Okay, and so this is also why I stressed last lesson that it's very important that you understand how to graph and how to interpret graphs. Okay, and so let's just look at this. So this is the production possibilities curve right now, and so we have 3 points that I've shown you, and there's A, B, and C. So if we look at A is an inefficient scenario. B is a scenario of maximum capacity. And C is an unattainable scenario. Okay? So let's just look at what B might mean. Okay? So if we have bread, and so we went down this line, B, this could be, 10 loaves of bread right here. Okay? And if this is 10 loaves of bread, and hits the line, and this could be 15 shirts. Okay? So in this scenario, if you produce at level B, our economy could produce 10 bread and 15 shirts. And this line talks about our maximum capacity. So if we utilize every single resource we had, every person is working, and we choose to produce bread and shirts at the same time, we can produce 10 loaves of bread and 15 shirts. Okay? So that's a maximum capacity scenario. That B could be anywhere on this curve, and we'd still be at maximum capacity scenario. Okay? So what does this inefficiency mean? If we're producing right here, this could be, 3 loaves of bread and 5 shirts. So if our economy produces 3 loaves of bread and 5 shirts today, we are being inefficient because we could have produced 10 loaves of bread and 15 shirts, but we didn't. We only produced 3 and 5, right? So that's an inefficiency. And up here, C is unattainable. This is impossible, right? Because this could be 15 loaves of bread, and this could be 20 shirts. So if our economy tried to produce 15 loaves of bread and 20 shirts, we wouldn't be able to, because at maximum efficiency and capacity, we can only produce 10 loaves of bread and 15 shirts. Okay? We're going to look at another example of this later, but hopefully those 3 points made sense to you. So I kept on talking about B being on this maximum capacity line. So if you look at the PPC, I tend to think of this as the entire graph. The production possibilities curve is the entire visual of the entire thing. A, B, and C are all visually incorporated into this graph. Okay? PPF, the production possibilities frontier, is the maximum potential output of an economy. And so the frontier would be the line. The line is the maximum of what our country can produce or our economy can produce. Okay, so the PPF is in the PPC. The PP sees the entire thing. The PPF looks at the maximum potential output. So that is our discussion of the production possibilities curve. We're going to talk about another example of this in a moment. But please be sure that you understand conceptually what this is, thinking also about the assumptions that we've made. So let's look at some economic laws, 3 of them specifically. So the law of increasing relative cost. Okay, so economists are pretty straightforward with their language. So it's law of increasing, something is going higher. What is that something going higher? The relative cost is going higher. So this is a law, and it talks about increasing relative cost. So the law states, the cost of producing one product increases relative to another product. Okay? So what does this mean? We need to understand what relative cost means. Relative cost is the cost of producing one item in terms of not being able to produce another. Okay? So this is like opportunity cost. Relative cost is an opportunity cost, but the relative cost is specific to cost of producing one item and then not being able to produce another item. Okay? So it's much more specific to 2 specific things, whereas opportunity cost is much more of a generalized thing. So that's the relative cost. So we're talking about the law of increasing relative cost. Okay, so let's look at what this means. And so we need to take a deep dive into these statistics to understand what the law of increasing relative cost is saying to us. And so I just want to talk about what this graph says, or what this chart says, and then I'm going to ask you to graph it. So we have possible production, A, B, C, D, E, and F. So these are all different possibilities, and these production possibilities are our maximum production possibilities. Okay? So we can produce bikes or loaves of bread. Okay? So we're talking about the production possibilities of 2 things, which is what our assumption talked about for a production possibilities curve. And so we can produce 0 bikes and 15,000 loaves of bread. That's possibility A. Or we can produce 1 bike and 14,000 loaves of bread. That's possibility B. There are also possibilities in between those, but we're not going to cut bikes in half. So let's look at what that means. Just the first 2 differences, okay? From 0 to 1 bike, so I've increased my bike production by 1. And so if my economy is working at capacity, it means that I need to stop producing a certain amount of loaves of bread, right? So I need to stop producing 1,000 loaves of bread to create that 1 bike, right? I need to allocate my resources from making these breads to making 1 bike. I didn't lose all my bread, but I made 1 bike, so I lost 1,000 loaves of bread, okay? 2, production possibility C is to make 2 bikes or 12,000 loaves of bread. Okay, so if I want to go from 1 bike to 2 bikes, I'm only making 1 more bike right here. So 1 bike to 2 bikes, I've increased my bike production by 1. Okay, so to get that 1 bike, my loaves of bread declined by 2,000. Okay, so for the first bike, the relative cost was 1,000, or opportunity cost here, but it is relative cost because I'm talking about the cost of 1 bike in terms of not being able to produce 1,000 loaves of bread. Okay? That was the cost of my first. The cost of my second bike, my second 1 bike, is 2,000 loaves of bread. The cost of my third bike is 3,000 loaves of bread. My fourth bike, 4,000. My fifth bike, I went from 4 bikes and 5,000 loaves of bread to 5 bikes and 0 loaves of bread. So my relative cost for that 5th bike, that 1/5 bike, was 5,000 loaves of bread. So you can see, this is a law of increasing. These values are increasing relative cost. Okay? So that's what the law is, and we'll talk about it a bit more in a minute. So the first thing I want you to do is to graph this. Graph our production possibilities. Bikes and bread. So I want you to plot points A, B, C, D, E, and F on a graph. And you could think of bikes and bread as your X and Y coordinates. Bikes could be X-axis or Y-axis. Bread could be X-axis or Y-axis. Doesn't matter. But you could just think of it if you made a table and you wrote down X up here and Y here. these are your coordinate points. Okay, so take a minute, pause the video, and do that right now. Again, remember, we want to practice graphing to make sure you can graph and understand it and do it accurately. So pause the video and do that for a few minutes now. So hopefully now you've finished the graph, and so your graph should look something like my graph. If it doesn't, that's okay. Again, let me know and we can figure out how to get up to speed with graphing. So this should be what your graph looks like if you did bikes on the x-axis and loaves of bread on the y-axis. If you flip them, that doesn't matter as long as it has a similar shaped curve. So if I went from 15,000 loaves of bread and 0 bikes, I want to increase to 1 bike, I lose 1,000 loaves of bread. My second bike, I lost 2,000 loaves of bread from this point to this point. I lost 3,000 loaves of bread, 4,000 loaves of bread, and ultimately 5,000 loaves of bread. So this is my production possibilities curve, right? I can produce 3 bikes and 9,000 loaves of bread right here. I could also produce 3 bikes and 4,000 loaves of bread if I produce that point right here. However, that would be inefficient. At the same token, I could produce 3 bikes and 12,000 loaves of bread. No, I can't. That is a point that is impossible or unattainable because this curve represents my maximum resource potential, my maximum capacity. Okay, so this is an example of the production possibilities curve. Again, if you have questions, please send me SB messages or let me know in class. All right. Next theory. The next economic law is the law of diminishing returns. So again, language should be fairly straightforward. Diminishing, kind of going down. Returns is like what you get out of it. Okay. So it states that output will increase. So this is my return. My output is my return. Output will increase when input increases, but only to a certain point. Okay, so what do I mean here? Okay, so we're talking about a situation that our inputs are increasing. Okay, inputs are increasing, and output's also increasing, but it's only going to increase up to a certain point in time because the returns will diminish based on our output increasing. Okay, so I'm kind of fumbling with words. It's easier to look at the graph, okay? So, imagine we have inputs, land and workers. Could be any inputs, but we're taking 2. So our land, we start with 10 hectares of land and 1 worker. And so, in this law, our inputs have to be limited, or we want to say our inputs are scarce, okay? And so, in this situation, we're talking about we can get more workers, okay? But we only own 10 hectares of land. So as a business owner or as a farmer or whatever I'm doing, I own this land, and for me to get more land is going to be very difficult, but I can hire more workers, no problem. So I have 10 hectares of land and I hire 1 worker. That worker on that land can produce for me 1,000 corn. Okay? Sounds great. I think to myself, you know what? Let's make some more money. I hire another worker, and that worker with 10 hectares of land. So now there's 2 workers on 10 hectares of land, and they can produce for me 2,000 corn. So by hiring that second worker or 1 more worker, the yield increased by 1,000. So my return has increased by 1,000, right? So my output will increase when input increases. Correct. That did happen. Okay? So I still have 10 hectares of land. I hire another worker. And now whether I have 3 workers, the corn I produced is 2,800. So what's my increase in yield? My increase in yield is now 800. Okay? So again, my output increased because my input increased, but it has diminished. Okay? My return has diminished. It's gone down. Okay, let's look at it again. 10 hectares of land, I hire another worker. My 4th worker, now I can produce 3,400 corn. And my increase in corn is 600. So I'm still increasing my output. But the return of that increase is going down. And so if I go on, the fifth worker only gives me 400 more. The sixth worker only gives me 100 more. And ultimately, when I go from 6 workers who produce 3,900, I hire another worker, and that group of workers still only produces 3,900. And that doesn't mean that that seventh worker just sat in their butt and did nothing. That means by adding that seventh worker, maybe every worker got a little bit less efficient because there's so little land or whatnot, right? And so increase in my yield was 0. My returns actually diminished all the way down to nothing. So you can see, like, why does this matter so much? As hire as many people as you want. Yeah, that person just cost you money, right? That person cost you money and you didn't get any more product, right? Imagine you can sell every corn for $1, right? That sixth person you hired made you $100. If they cost you more than $100, you don't hire them, right? This person made you no money. So clearly their cost is greater than 0, right? So you have to understand that. And so the question is going to be, why does this happen? So if you look at any room that you say, wherever you are right now, you look at that room, you think about, okay, if you had to do something in that room, work, do something, build something, make something, whatever, think about how many of you could you fit in that room to efficiently work, right? What if you said that number would be 6? Okay. And I said, well, add another person. You add a seventh person to that room, you lose efficiency. You lose the ability to create at the maximum potential, right? And so we're overworking our land. You know, it's very simple. If I said this was 7 million people, you're not going to fit 7 million people on 10 hectares of land, right? What if this was 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 people? 100, 200, 300, 700 people, right? It's just these workers are too many for the scarcity of the land, right? Because we have scarcity, we can't get more land, therefore our returns will diminish, right? This is a law. This will happen inevitably. In all scenarios, if there is scarcity of an input, then we will have diminishing returns eventually, okay? The next theory we're going to look at is similar yet basically the opposite. This is the law of increasing returns to scale. So again, we're increasing our returns now. The previous theory was decreasing returns. We're increasing our returns to scale, and that's an important concept. So the theory or the law states, as one increases the scale, all productive inputs. So when I talk about scale, I'm talking about size. I'm talking about magnitude, right? We're talking about the strength and power of a large organization, right, to operate with scale. All productive inputs, as one increases the scale of operations, the rate of return will increase. So my returns will increase as my scale increases. So economies of scale. This increasing returns to scale requires economies of scale to be a real thing. And so what is that thing? That is the greater efficiency a firm can achieve when producing very large amounts of output. Okay? When you think of why can companies produce cheaper? Typically that's large, powerful companies, right? Think about the most powerful, most cheap companies in the world. You're looking at big, powerful companies, right? Because they have scale, because they can operate with these grand networks, logistics, ability, right? These companies have massive scale, right? So think about when you have a firm like Best Buy that bought Futures Autos, that's old. When you think about two firms buying each other, right? They increase their scale because they can duplicate things. Two car companies merging or buying each other. They don't need as many manufacturing plants, maybe. They don't need 2 accounting departments. Whatever it may be, they can gain greater efficiency by getting larger, by producing more, by getting bigger warehouses, right? By getting bigger fields, right? This is all happening, right? So our law is talking about increasing returns when you have scale. And why does this happen? Let's take a look. So if you look at this chart, very similar to our previous chart, except now, along with increasing my workers, I'm also increasing my land. So 10 hectares and 1 worker produce 1,000 corn, consistent with my previous example. Okay? But now this example went 20 hectares and 2 workers. My yield increased by 1,000, so I went from 1,000 to 2,000. Fine, great. But now, if I go from 30 hectares and 3 workers, I get 3,200 produced. My yield has gone up, so my returns have increased because my scale is increasing, right? The size of my business is increasing by land and by workers, right? 40 hectares and 4 workers, my yield goes up 1,400. So I'm increasing my ability to produce faster than the amount of input I put in. So my cost of production is going down per unit of production, right? At 70 and 7, my increase in yield was 2,000, right? So I'm getting faster, I'm getting better, I'm getting more efficient, and it's getting me relatively cheaper. My total cost is going up. My total cost per unit is going down. So this only works when you can increase size and scale of your operation, right? If you think about any kind of mom and pop shop or any small business or work from home business, someone who makes their own, a seamstress, or someone who works in textiles, or anyone who makes their own jewelry, those kind of small scale types of things, the cost of production is extraordinarily high because, one, those people can't access resources as well, and the cost of their labor is enormous, right? The moment you start creating a factory, getting an assembly line, mechanizing some type of production, right? Although the investment may be there, a little bit more cost, like buying pieces of land, your cost per unit are going to start going down. Your speed is going to increase, right? You can specialize, right? Instead of one worker doing everything, like imagine farming corn is a 4-step process, okay? This worker has to do every step. When they hire another worker, and it's a 4-step process, now he can do 2 steps, and he can do 2 steps, right? A 3rd worker, a 4th worker. Now, each one of these workers only needs to do 1 step over and over and over and over and over again on a bigger piece of land. If you do the same thing over and over and over again, you're going to get faster at it, right? And so those are the types of things that happen when you increase your scale and you increase the scale of your operation, the size and power of your business. So that's the lesson, or the lesson on a law of increasing returns to scale. And so today we did 3 fallacies, the production possibilities curve, and 3 laws. So again, this was a bit more heavy lesson than last. So please ensure that you send me messages with questions, asking for clarity to make sure you know what's going on here. I know sometimes that these concepts can be difficult to get, so make sure you also take a look at the textbook to make sure that you can get this. Again, send me messages. I'll try to respond as soon as possible. Thank you.